Steve, are we on? Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started so we can ask a lot of questions. And if we run out, we'll let you jump in and ask town hall questions. Who's got one for these two? They were worried after spending 24 hours with me what I might ask them tonight. I didn't show you the back. No, I'm teasing. So we have Jim and Denise Manchester with us, who serve with Envision Cleveland, if you weren't here this morning, and we're excited to get to know them this week. And this is really our chance to see them not just in their role as staff of Envision Cleveland, but as brothers and sisters in Christ, and how the Lord has worked in their lives over the last 50-ish years, I guess. Heavy on the ish, huh, for the younger girl over here? Okay, so.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, we're so happy.
For those of you who are joining us at home, thank you for joining us live.
So, Tim and I have got to hear a little bit about their story. So, Denise, let's start with you growing up in the middle, I shouldn't say nowhere, growing up in central Minnesota. We have to say it that way, I think.
Yes, you have to pronounce the O.
Minnesota.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You betcha.
You betcha. Okay, we're going to practice talking like the Midwesterners. So tell everybody how the Lord brought you to him from a non-Christian home. What happened?
Well, my heavens to stars, it's a great story, let me tell you.
Stars, okay.
When I was a young child, we lived way, way out in farm country, and our closest neighbor lived on the nearest farm about a mile down the road. And I was like in third grade, and Mrs. Neva Huffman, my neighbor down the farmway, she would go into town every Sunday morning to do her grocery shopping, and she would take her two children that were about my age and drop them off at Sunday school at a Methodist church. And they invited me to come with. And so getting out of the house and getting to go to town was kind of a big deal. And so I would go with them on Sunday mornings to this little Methodist church in Malacca, Minnesota. And that's how I came to know the Lord, was through my Sunday school teacher there, Mrs. Judy Stewart. Her and her husband ran the jewelry store in town, and she shared Jesus with me. But I would say that my coming to Jesus was a bit of church and Dairy Queen. Ice cream definitely played a big part in coming to know Jesus.
So she really liked that we were having ice cream tonight. That was very fitting in honor of this story.
Yes, so because after Sunday school, we would always get to stop at Dairy Queen to get a Star Kiss or Buster Bar before we'd head back to the farms. And it was just a really great deal. And then about a year into this Dairy Queen Jesus deal, one day coming out of church, my parents were coming up the sidewalk, and I was like, wait a minute, what are you guys doing here? Like,
this is my gig.
This is my gig. Like,
it's my ice cream gig.
Dairy Queen and Jesus. And so my parents started to come to church. Around the time I was in fourth grade. And so that was the beginning of my going to church. Yeah.
Isn't that a great story? The neighbor who brings them. And of course, that woman never stayed. She just dropped the kids off at Sunday school and did her grocery shopping. Mm-hmm. And from this, God was building this future missionary and his great servant. So that's just a great story. So invite everybody for ice cream. Here we go.
That's right.
Okay, meanwhile, in the other chair, the lapsed Catholic who confessed this morning to this really didn't get to know. Now, I don't know, can we jump straight to that, or should we do your story before we get to Jim meeting Jesus?
Well, it's kind of tied together.
It is kind of tied together.
After I left high school and I joined the military right out of high school, I really stopped going to church. Just because traveling around the military just wasn't great. The military wasn't great for, I don't know, it just was hard. So I fell away from church. And fast forward to we were married and we had our own daughter together. When I married Jim, he had a son already. So we have two children. We had our daughter together. And our daughter used to go to daycare while I was at work at this lady named, we called her Grandma Janice. She was a lady who stayed at home and quilted, and she watched our daughter. And the neighbors to Grandma Janice, they had 2 little boys, and that mom and her boys invited our daughter to go to Awanas. Do you know what Awanas is? Okay. Go
Dad
Sparkies.
serves on the board, so he's excited. That Awana is in this story.
So it's another interesting story how the child first started going to church, and then the parents came. But our daughter had been going to Awanas. She was a little Sparky for about a year, and she was so proud of that little vest and badge, and I would go and pick her up afterwards. She got to a point in her Sparky book where it said, to get the next gem in your badge, you need to attend Sunday school. And so there was quite a discussion in our house because there had been some things in our married life where church was really toxic. There was a lot of legalism in our families. And we just had both kind of agreed that if that was Christianity, we didn't want to set foot in a church. So there was a big discussion about, well, she really wants to get this gem and she really wants to go to Sunday school. Who's going to take her? And we bickered back and forth. And of course, I ended up taking her.
I was not giving in.
Not giving in. He was really anti-church. And so I agreed to take her to Sunday school, but you know what? We are not staying for church, just Sunday school, and then we're out.
Was there a Dairy Queen nearby?
No.
No Dairy Queen. Okay, that
was
the
part of
first
the
problem.
issue, maybe.
That was part of the issue.
So. Okay.
But guess what the next week was? To get the next gem in your badge, you need to attend church. Well, I did Sunday school, so he should have to do church, right? Right?
Nope.
He refused. And I said, all right, I will take you to church, but I'm sitting in the back, and when it's done, we're out. Like, that's it. And I went to church that day, and I sat in the back row. And then Jesus had a conversation with me straight from the pulpit. And he told me everything I needed to hear.
And your heart was open, and you heard him clearly that
I
day.
heard him clearly. There was a lot of things from my past that I didn't think I could be forgiven for, that I could never be back in God's good graces for. If there's anyone here tonight who is in that same situation, I just want to share with you that is such a lie of the enemy. I heard that day that God will forgive me, and he loves me as far as the east is from the west, and he's never left me. I would say I was really healed that day. My heart was repaired that day. I was the prodigal daughter running back to Jesus that day. And I went home and I said, Jim, you need to come with me next Sunday. This pastor was talking about the Jesus that I remember. And he's a merciful, loving, forgiving Jesus, not all this legalistic hoop jumping and, condemnation that we've been having thrown at us by some people. And I just was like, I'm going back. Will you come with me?
And no, I was not going to go.
Jim did not change his mind here at first.
No, I did not. And maybe I could share a bit of my journey. So I mentioned I am a recovering Catholic. I went to Catholic school through 6th grade. Left the Catholic Church when I was about 16 years old, when I didn't have to go anymore. Came from a very Catholic background. Let me preface this with there is no scandal, but my mother actually served as a Sister of Mercy for 19 years, straight out of high school, and left the convent to care for her mom in her mom's later years. And my dad grew up in New York City and was actually an altar boy trainer at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. So to say my parents were Catholic is kind of an understatement. They were very Catholic. But for me, I struggled. Catholic school was terrible for me, and I saw a lot of things, as we see anywhere, where people are not truly following Jesus. And so anyway, for the longest time, I was very anti-church. Our wedding ceremony was another story, and it made it difficult to want to go back. But
The pastor who did our wedding actually got fired after our wedding.
it was that bad.
It was that bad. Yeah.
You can ask him about that story. Tim and I heard it, and we're just agape our mouths. It was crazy, but
The opening line of your wedding never should be that USA Today reports 51% of all marriages end in fail and divorce.
and that was not the worst part. So that was the best part.
No, that
of
was
the whole
just
thing.
the intro. So, all that to say, and I'm going to quote one of my customers. He was an old Italian from Chicago, and I worked for him out in Utah, and I told him a little bit about the stuff that had happened. And in typical Italian style, he says, no, no, no. You don't let those bums come between you and God. Referring to, you don't let people stand in the way. I mean, people are going to do things. People will let you down, but don't let that interfere with your relationship with Jesus. It's such a tragedy when that happens. But so Denise was trying to convince me to go, and it wasn't happening. And eventually she tapped into a little Catholic guilt.
His mother had also been praying for him.
She'd been praying for me for a number of years, that she just really wanted me to follow Jesus. And so it was Christmas Eve, and they kind of talked me into going. There was going to be, the pastor always wrote this original story for Christmas Eve service, and it would make my mother happy if I would go. So I went, and the funny thing, I'm friends with, obviously, the pastor who was instrumental in leading me to the Lord. He said, I remember the night you came. You looked like you wanted to kill me. My defenses were up. I was looking very stern. But really, I mean, that night it was different. And I did end up coming again. I ended up having conversations with him. He never pressed. But he allowed me to wrestle with the tough questions. And for me, that I had to wrestle with it. It's just the way I'm wired. And I did a lot of research into things, whether or not I could actually trust the Bible and trust God. And God spoke to me in ways that it's hard to, he uses situations for me. That situations will come up at just the right time. And that's part of our missions story and part of our Cleveland story. He would do things at just the right time that were just too much of a coincidence. We have a friend who said, there are no coincidences, just God incidents. So, and we've found that to be true. And once I did decide to become a believer, I was not going to waste any time. And I decided I was all in, and it went very fast from there.
So that's now been nearly 17 years ago or so?
Yeah, about 17 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back in time just a little bit, because we saw that picture of this cute girl hanging from a tree, hanging from branches. What were you doing in that picture this morning?
I was in the camo.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, you were looking awful cute. I can see what happened next. But so Jim shared that he was married very young and had joined the Air Force not too long after that.
A few years later, yeah. I got married at 19, joined the Air Force at 22, needing to get something to help care for my family. When I got married, I got instant family. She already had a 3-year-old daughter, and we had my son about a year after we got married. So in the area we were in the Adirondacks, there just weren't a whole lot of good jobs. All of my relatives were either customs agents or prison guards. That was kind of your options. So I needed to get out of that area. And I'd always had kind of a desire for all things involving aircraft and been always interested in the Air Force. And the thought came to mind, and that's what I ended up doing. When I did get to Germany, my first wife decided that my supervisor and friend looked like a better deal and ended up leaving. So that left me in a place where I ended up back in the dorms. I fought for the marriage, but it just wasn't going to happen.
So tell us what happened next. What was your job at that point? You guys will like this. What was your job meanwhile? Denise, what were you doing on the base? You were already there, right?
Well, by day I was a secretary or administrative. I was the base commander's secretary, so I knew a lot of Jim's story just because it's like when you work in the office, you know what's happening with everybody. It was a really small unit of 100 people, so everybody knows everybody's stuff. And I saw how hard he fought to keep his marriage together, and so it was really heartbreaking, when it did fall apart. But I also saw a lot of qualities in him that were like, man, he's got a lot of good qualities of a husband. He fights for his marriage, and so we were friends. And I was going to be going home at Christmas time for 2 weeks of leave from the military, and I'd asked all the girls on the military base in our unit, hey, do you want to go stay in my apartment off base and get out of the dorms? And all the girls had somewhere to go. But one girlfriend, mutual friend of ours, she said, I don't need someplace to go, but you know who does is Jim. He's in the dorms with his 2 kids and a roommate, and, the dorm rooms are like tiny. And they share a bathroom between another dorm with 2 other guys. And it was just like, oh, man, that's terrible. So I invited him.
How old were the children at this point?
At this point, my son was 3, Ashley was 8, I think.
Just imagine this, moms. Oh my gosh. So here you were. That sounds pretty tough. Pretty tough. Okay, so I assume Jim said yes to this.
Yeah. I said, I got a 2-bedroom apartment. You can set up my Christmas tree. I just need a ride to the airport. And while I was gone,
I've got a funny story at the airport. I'll let her finish, but remind me to tell you the funny story at the airport.
he fixed my dryer that squeaked. He fixed my stereo. He fixed all these little things around my apartment. It was like, wow, thank you. And then he left stuff there, so he had to come back.
He was no dummy here.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Strategic about that.
Uh-huh.
So this was, well before 9/11, but it was at Frankfurt Airport, and so we had lunch together at the airport when I drove her down there, and I decided to help carry her bags back. And I don't know how, but somehow I kind of got past the point of no return, where the only way to get back through was through customs. And as I was making my way around customs, the Aeroflot flight from Moscow arrived. So I was in this sea of people from Russia. Well, when we were in the military, when you go into a military base, anytime you go in, you have to show your ID to get on the base. So I kept mine in the ashtray so that it was always easy to show at the base. Well, I left it in the car when I went in the airport. So I had no photo ID, and all I had was my USAR driver's license, U.S. Army in Europe. There's no picture on it. And
so this is 1993 or so? 92?
92.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like Christmas 91, 92. Mm-hmm.
So the wall was down, but tensions were still kind of there between us and Russia. And this customs agent kept asking me, and he could see that I was like sunk. And praise God, he had a moment of pity and just said, just go.
Or else you would be behind. Well, the Iron Curtain had just fallen, so at least you weren't in any grave danger.
Yeah, locked up abroad somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so these two ended up getting married. It was an awful wedding, but the marriage just turned out well here 29 years later. So you shared this morning that you've had a whole bunch of jobs in a whole bunch of places. And I think what's always interesting is hearing how God got a hold of using the skills that you weren't seeing the proper skill set to be a pastor or a missionary. So what kind of skills were you bringing forward when you finally made these decisions that you were going to serve God full time here?
Well, let's see. In the military, I was an electronics technician. I worked on microwave and satellite communications equipment. Then I worked on electronic security and surveillance systems for weapon storage areas and alert aircraft parking areas, protecting dangerous stuff. We'll leave it at that. And then I worked for a company called Schlumberger in the oil field. It was another electronics job, a lot of skills with tools that used nuclear sources or generated neutron radiation. Then I started a business with an electrical engineer. I'd been working on computers as a side thing most of my life. And we started a business doing automation. And what we did was, if you're familiar with smart homes at all, so we did control systems that controlled like all the lights, heating and air conditioning, fireplaces, window shades, music systems, security cameras, security system.
Hot tubs.
In these tiny 10,000 square foot houses they were helping, yeah.
Yeah, and actually the largest one that we worked on in 2009 was 56,000 square feet. Had 2 lanes of bowling, an indoor rifle range, a 35-seat movie theater, full court basketball, swimming pool with
And
a lazy river.
housekeepers, I hope?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean,
3 people lived
3
there.
people lived there, not including the staff that had to care for and clean the place. It was just ridiculous. He spent almost $1 million just in the system that we did.
Okay, Denise, you were home helping raise these kids. Did you work through those early years when
I've always worked, yeah. So in the military, I was administrative by day, but if we went to war or, exercises in the field, I was a nuclear, biological, chemical warfare technician. And roughly that meant, like, if you're deployed and someone is going to drop chem gas or mustard, something, nukes, whatever near you, it was my job to take the intel of what it was and how far it was away, use, like, what direction is the wind going? Is it coming towards us or away from us? If it's coming towards us, what's my wind speed? What's my temperature? I'm calculating how quickly it's going to get to us to know if we have time to get away from it, or do we all need to hurry up and get in our gas masks?
Now look at their skill set. Isn't this interesting? And then God said, Mongolia. Now just let's go with this.
But it gets better. I worked at a Harley shop after that.
Oh, I forgot about that. Okay, so she's got some practical skills now.
And as a waitress.
As a waitress, house cleaner,
Psychometrist.
for the Department of Psychology at the Wyoming State Hospital. Used to do testing on people who had committed crimes and needed to have competency evals before going to court.
Okay, this gets better all the time. Okay, so you were living in Wyoming but having a business in Utah. In case you wondered why the business was in another state, they were right on the border there. And what possessed you to look on the Alliance website and find out that someone was coming home from Mongolia?
Well, actually, we had a friend who's part of the Alliance. Her name's Kimberly Thomas. And she would go around and do field audits for a lot of the missions fields. And so she was over in Mongolia doing one of these audits, and they expressed to her that they really didn't know what they were going to do because they needed somebody to fill in to be the field accountant. And we had been there on a few trips. She knew our heart for Mongolia. We'd been there on some short-term trips.
So this is after you were then the youth pastor somewhere when you were...
Nope,
No, this is all before
pastor.
that.
This
Okay.
is back when I was a worship director
Okay.
at our first church.
You got these jobs straight. You can see where I got confused. Okay, you were being a worship director. Kimberly knew they needed an accountant in Mongolia.
Sent us this email, just kind of relaying the story, and said, just thought you might want to know how much you guys have a heart for Mongolia. And we received the email, and we're like, yeah, sure, it sounds great, but how can we do that?
Yeah, I mean, who just has a year to take off to go to Mongolia? Also, at the same time, there was Eric and Christina Wallen had just started U Bean Coffee House and Roastery there as a brand new business to the government in April, and then in June they were coming on their home assignment. And so how do you just leave a new business without someone taking it over? And so we went and filled those two roles. They call it Give Back Now. The Alliance has a program, so like anybody with job skills can go and fill in for missionaries who are coming on their home assignment year. It's a really great thing, whether 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever you.
Yeah, there's a lot
Time
of
to
things
do.
that they can use help with. Sometimes it's accounting. It might be computer skills. I wired up computer networks in some of the buildings, helped with computer issues, set up servers, things like that on previous trips.
Yeah, at the coffee shop while I was there, I was helping teaching baking skills. So it was like a vocational training, teaching a baker how to bake cinnamon rolls, how to bake cakes and decorate cakes with fancy instruments, and setting up menus, creating salads and lunch menus for the cafe, things like that. And then
How
we
to figure
worked
out pricing. and all that.
pricing just to make sure the business turned a profit and could pay everybody that worked there. So it was a neat opportunity and time. And the coffee shop was such a great place because it was used by, I remember it was near the universities there in the city. And so like Campus Crusade would come and they'd say, hey, can we hold a Campus Crusade event in the coffee shop this afternoon? Like, yeah, come on down. We'd love to have you guys there. And you'd always see pastors sitting in there having conversations with people from around the city, and you'd see Bible studies happening, and it was just such a great little place in the city to see Jesus doing what Jesus does over a cup of coffee.
We had some great open mic nights too. But in our story of getting there, we said, we kind of got to the point, it's like, all right, well, maybe God would do this. So, God, here's the problems that we see. First, we got to come up with 30 grand
In 9 months.
for the costs of going there. I've got to have my business partner agree to me going to the other side of the planet for a year. We have to find schooling for our daughter. We have to find someone to help care for my mom because we were her guardians at that point. She was in an assisted living. So we saw all these huge barriers, and
Yeah.
one by one,
We corporately prayed as a family and said, God, if you will help us with these things, we will be obedient and go.
we send out one prayer letter, and we received about $25,000 back.
I love that.
That got our attention.
Yeah, that got our attention. I was like, okay.
Maybe we're supposed to do this.
Yep, and my business partner was somehow amenable. He was not a believer. We found a lady who used to be the manager at the assisted living that my mother was at, who was a nurse, and she said she would be honored to do it, and she would not take any sort of payment.
For taking care of Jim's mom, yeah.
Yep.
The state of Wyoming came out with free K-12 online public schooling just like a year or two before that, and so we were able to keep our daughter in public schooling. They gave us the laptop and all of her school books and things that she needed for that year. We had a lady in our church who basically just moved into our house. She needed a place to live, and we needed someone to watch our cat and keep the utilities going. So she did that for us. That was another blessing. It was just like all these things that we thought were huge obstacles. God just was like a feather on his hand, just went, not a big deal to him. So we said, okay, we're going.
So you had been before, so you knew a little bit about what it looked like and how it was there. We got into a conversation about what was the food like in Mongolia. We have to do this before we get our ice cream to eat. Okay. So tell us about some of the interesting adventures you had with food in Mongolia, especially the cheeseburger idea. They'll like that one.
Okay. Well, our first trip there in 2008, we went way out in the countryside. So a lot of Mongolia, there's no roads. You're just driving across the steppe. They call it the steppe. It's grasslands. And we go out to where there's this nomadic family, and they've got a herd of a couple hundred horses there. And we meet them there, and we go into their ger. It's what you would call a yurt. It's the round tent that they live in. And we're going to have a meal, and they decide that they're going to make some soup. Well, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and obviously there's no tap to get the water from. So you look upstream, and you see all the horses playing in the water.
The camels, the horses, the goats, the sheep, they're all in the water.
So they scoop the water out of the river and made our soup for the day. Then they brought out their traditional specialty drink for us to have. It's called edik. And edik is fermented horse's milk. So the way they make it, they use enzymes from a goat's stomach and milk from the horses, and they allow it to ferment.
It's like kefir, only not as great.
Think really hard cider vinegar with a bad cheese finish.
Scent of old gym socks.
Yes. Then we got something called arl. Arl is made from the same stuff. Well, what they do is they slather it on the top of the ger, on the roof, and let it dry in the sun. And then they cut it off into these little bricks. I had a friend who came back he liked to go on tour. He'd bring some of the arl back, and he would give it to people, and they would take a bite, and then he would say, "Let me describe what you're experiencing right now." It's got the texture and consistency of wet drywall and the taste and odor of old gym socks.
I bet no one asked for a second piece.
No.
No.
I used to just put it in my mouth for a minute and then slip it in my pocket.
You have to be real strategic with that napkin.
Okay. So tell us about those cheeseburgers that were offered to you guys.
So we had our field forum, which is when all the people from the different cities around the country get together once a year for prayer and planning. And it was a place called the Mongolian Secret History Camp. And we stayed in Gers for the week, and the staff there wanted to do something nice for us and make us some burgers, because we're Americans. A lot of us were Americans, and we like burgers. So they made them, but then it took a little while for us to get there, so they got a little bit cold.
Well, first off, they were made from sheep, not hamburger.
Yes, not ground beef, ground mutton. When you let a burger that is made with ground mutton sit for a little while,
A lot of fat content.
a lot of fat content, and it congeals really nicely into this white film on the surface. And I remember
Do you want those instead of ice cream? Shall we have mutton burgers cold with the side of that awful stuff? No.
Yeah. One of the children of the missionaries who were working with was like, "Mommy, what is that stuff? What's that white stuff?" This is kind of typical for a missionary mom, I think. it's just cheese. Just eat it.
Jenny, are you listening to that? It's just cheese.
We always just prayed a special prayer. And just, God, if you help us to, if we'll put it down, will you help us keep it down?
Yeah, missionary grace. I'll put it down if you'll keep it down.
Okay, so they spent the year in Mongolia and came home again to the States. So did you return then to South Wyoming? Is that where you were?
We were in southwest Wyoming. We did return there briefly, but partway through our year in Mongolia, remember I talked about this absolutely ridiculously large house that we worked in. I worked for your top half percenters, extremely wealthy people, flew on private jets sometimes. People who don't need to be served, but really like to be served. And then we went to Mongolia, and our nearest and dearest friends either lived in really Spartan apartments or some lived in tents. They lived in these gers in the Ger district. And the thing that solidified it for me, it's one of those experiences that's just surreal. It's a Mongolian tradition if you have your first child that a few months later, the elders are going to come out and just bring some gifts and share some advice on raising your family, raising your children. So we drive way out to the outskirts that he commuted from every day. And we're in this, it's called the Ger district, where all these people are living. So think about it. It's 30 below zero, first off. No running water. The bathroom is outside. Uh-huh. And they're raising an infant in this tent. What advice do you give to this family? You know, we obviously gave some form of advice as far as raising children and discipline and things like that. But when I thought about that, and I've got a picture of a ger that was right outside the community center where Denise worked. And I like to look at it fairly regularly. And I actually made a picture where it's on one side and one of these houses I worked with is on the other.
To help you remember.
And to answer the question, who are you going to serve?
So you came home changed from your year in Mongolia.
Wrecked, yeah.
Well, halfway through our year, when he wrestled with this call from God of who are you going to serve?
Decided to sell my half of the business from Mongolia. So did that all over the internet back in 2013.
So there we were sitting in outer Mongolia with no work, no job to go back to. We
Good
still have
plan,
a
right?
mortgage to pay for. But we're going to trust God. And we're going to follow him.
And he just left you there in Mongolia.
No.
No. Okay, good.
So we got contacted actually by the same pastor who had been the one who helped lead me to the Lord in Wyoming. While we were in Mongolia, ended up going to another church in north central Iowa. And he Skyped with us one night and just said, thought I would check in, see if, what your plans are, if you're going when you come back.
Skype was before FaceTime and Zoom for our younger members of the audience. Okay.
Yes. And so he began to tell me about this position. It was partially being a youth pastor, but also they had a big tech ministry in this church. And he thought that I would be able to help with that.
Tech, not tent.
Tech.
Yeah, it wasn't because he
Technology.
lived in a yurt that he was ready for this. No.
No. So we ended up taking a call to go to the middle of a cornfield in Iowa.
Town of 200. You couldn't buy gas there, you couldn't buy milk there. But they had a church, and on Sundays, 350 to 400 people would come out of the cornfield. It's like that movie.
Like the movie.
If you
Only
build
they were
it,
coming for Jesus
they will
instead
come.
of the zombies. That's good.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so you did that job. You did a lot of things in that church. And then somehow you ended up in Cleveland 3 years later. So what happened between Iowa and the church and you doing all these roles and going to Cleveland?
So I'm thankful God allowed me to be in so many different roles in the church to essentially exhaust that was not what he called me to. I led a youth group trip down to St. Louis, Missouri. It was right before the Ferguson riots back in 2014. And when I got in that setting where we were doing missions again, and we had people with us who had not experienced this yet, and you're kind of guiding them in that and guiding them to hear God's voice, that's where I felt alive. And I got to take a multi-generational team that had people from 15 to 62 were on that team, and we went down to Trujillo, Peru.
Yeah, with Inca Link.
Yep. It's actually an Envision site.
Yes.
And again, just felt alive in that setting. So go back to when we're in St. Louis, and I remember this conversation I had with Denise, and this work that they're doing is incredible. They're helping homeless people. They're helping to empower people to get out of poverty. They're introducing them to Jesus. They're providing hope. It's wonderful. I love what they're doing here. It reminds me of our work in Mongolia. I just can never do urban ministry. Fast forward, where's God going to call you then? Careful what you say never to, is the thing that we've learned. And a few years later, God ended up calling us to this ministry in Cleveland that we do now.
And I know, like, we did spend 3.5 years in Iowa, and I don't think it was for nothing. I do believe it was for you to really know that you were not called to be in a traditional pastor role.
And
we've
to
talked
continue
about
to
that.
be mentored by my pastor.
And
I thought a key sentence was he found out all the things he wasn't supposed to do. And
Yeah.
sometimes we're feeling like we're in that place in our life, but God was preparing you for what was going to come next.
one of the really great things about the Alliance, and I'm sure your pastor is the same way here, in that if you want to know what your gifts are, there are people in the Alliance who will help you figure that out. If you are really sincere about, I feel like God's calling me to something, but I don't know what that is, they will help you figure that out and help you find that place where God wants you to be. And I know that while we were in Iowa too, like during that 3.5 years, our daughter finished high school and she needed to be someplace to finish. And also all three of our parents passed away kind of during that time, and that was a time in which we could say goodbye to our parents. And then those responsibilities were lifted. So now we have, okay, what's next? And the district superintendent and
the
pastor.
district staff were really good to help me go through a bunch of evaluations and just have a lot of frank discussions about how I felt God was guiding me. And the DS at the time, the district superintendent, said, it's clear God has a call on your life. And I could help place you in another church setting, but honestly, I feel like in 3 years, you're going to be having this conversation with another district superintendent. I really think that the Lord has gifted you for some kind of non-traditional role. Have you considered Envision? So that was the direction that he kind of guided us, was to look into that.
Yeah, and Paul Honeycutt, who was the director of Envision Cleveland at the time that we started with Envision Cleveland, he used to be our youth pastor out in Evanston, Wyoming. He was there for like 2 years, and then he went up to Yellowstone Alliance Adventures to the youth camp up in Bozeman, Montana, and from there, then he went on to Ohio. So we kind of lost track with Paul. But so when the superintendent said, hey, check out Envision, we're like, well, we don't know anything about Envision. What is Envision? Nobody knows what Envision is.
Because it was pretty new at that point.
It was.
Pretty new and not real clear what.
Right. It went kind of through an identity search to figure out what Envision was going to be.
Yes.
Yeah. And so Jim called Paul, and he just left him a message. It was like, hey, haven't talked to you in a while. We were told to kind of call and check out and see, hey, what is Envision? What is Envision doing? We're like searching for, what could be next. And we'd just love to talk with you if you give us a call back. The night before, Paul and his wife, Lori, had just finished interviewing somebody to be site associates in Cleveland and had to turn them down. They just didn't feel like they were going to be a good fit. And they were sitting at their dining room table, and Lori said, wouldn't it be cool if Jim and Denise Manchester were available? And then he calls and leaves a message.
Remember that situational stuff that I mentioned earlier that God tends to do?
Don't you just love this? The message on the old school answering machine. Of course, it was probably digital at that point.
Probably is.
Within 24 hours of them saying, what if?
So when God does those things, and then you kind of perk up and you're like, okay, God, I hear you. I see what you're doing here.
It's not always easy, even though it was clear to us that God was getting our attention, and we went out to Cleveland on a look-see.
But we still said, but God, it's urban ministry, and we're rural people. We've always
middle of nowhere, both of them. This is their experience.
We live where there's more sheep than people. Okay.
Right. And our daughter is starting college. Is this really the time to transition from guaranteed pay to less pay that's not guaranteed?
It sounds like a sound financial plan.
The accountant in me was cringing.
It was horrified. Yeah.
Yeah, this was not a good fiscal idea, but the Lord, again, made things clear to us that if we didn't do this, we're essentially being disobedient. So we made the decision to go, and not knowing exactly what it was going to look like. At the time, Envision Cleveland didn't have any buildings or anything. I was just doing things with short-term teams and running around the city doing some projects.
It was still in its infancy as a nonprofit.
So they are going to share all about what's happening today over the next week while they're here. So we're going to kind of leave the story there because you have to come back to get more. But first, this is Tim's question. He wanted to know, in your daily lives right now, we know you've done all these different things, and now you're in this urban ministry that you never would have ever dreamed of. But tell us about what really delights you. What parts of the ministry do you just treasure in your heart and hold and know that you can get up the next day and keep doing this? We know there's lots of hard, but what are some of the delights along the way? I could probably guess, but let's see what you say.
I just delight in all the people. It's the people for me. God has brought so many people into my life that I get to share the good news with. God says in the Bible that He placed everybody where they're placed. He created the boundaries of where people live. He can move those boundaries. And God has literally moved people from across the ocean into my city. And I get to be their friend. I get to be the first one who says, hi, I'm so glad you're here.
And what was your word? Was it culture broker?
Yes.
I love this idea.
I get to be a cultural broker. A cultural broker is somebody who helps a newcomer navigate this new crazy culture they're living in, because everything is crazy. And having lived in Germany and Turkey and Mongolia myself, and having been that newcomer, I know how hard it is to try to navigate everyday life without speaking the language, how difficult it is to shop, to get your international driver's license, to deal with the government, everything. Some days it's mentally frustrating, and you just go home and you cry, and you're like, oh, it's so hard. And I remember all the people that God sent to me in my life to help be my cultural broker and my new local friend to navigate all those things and help teach me how to live in that place. When I was 19 years old and I moved to Germany, I caused an international incident. I moved into my first apartment off base, and I took my garbage out and I put it in the garbage can. There was like 10 garbage cans out there. They were all black. What did it matter which one I put it in? Well,
It turns out it did
it mattered. And when I
It
got back
mattered.
to my apartment, I hear all this commotion outside the window, and these people are yelling and screaming and pointing up at my apartment building because I'd put my trash in the wrong, I was like, but I needed someone to tell me, you can't do that. This one's yours.
Okay. So I love that. She's a people person. I've got some good friends out here in the audience who are very much wired, just like our Denise. And I love how that year in Mongolia prepared you to understand what our refugee people experience when they land here in the States. That's just how God, to put you in that exact situation and know He's got a plan for you having that tender heart for helping these people.
It was like we went back to boot camp, and God needed to prepare us. And so when things were really hard and you had to push through these things and you had friends who took pity on you and cared for you, God was working. We had no idea that one day we'd be doing what we do today, but it's clear in retrospect that God was preparing us and that those hardships and those difficulties had a purpose. We know what they're feeling, and we get to now be the person to kind of step in and be their friend and help.
And is that what brings you joy as well, or is there something to add to that?
So there's a young man that I work with. His name's Jean Kingombe, if you saw the video this morning. Yeah. I'm working with him now for the past 6 months or so. He's doing a vocational training program with me where I am teaching him software development, because I'm a computer programmer. I used to write all the software for the automation systems that we did. And I'm also teaching him business skills and accounting. I had the opportunity, right when we were bringing him on in September, there was a conference down in Sacramento, California. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Refugee and Immigrant Network of the Alliance. It's called RAIN. And
Have you guys heard of that before, anybody? Yeah, RAIN, RAIN.
if any of you end up at General Council, since it's a little bit closer for you this time, I'm sure RAIN will be there. There's usually like an informational luncheon type of thing. But what it is churches and other organizations within the Alliance that have made the decision that they're going to be a part of ministering to the nations who have come to us, to refugees and immigrants. And so I joined this last year, became part of their steering committee, and we had this conference in Sacramento and decided we were going to have Jean come with me. And, I love teaching him. I love the fact that vocational training is such this beautiful picture of discipleship to me. You're alongside each other, and believe it or not, even in technology and accounting, there are times that we end up having spiritual discussions. It's just the way it goes. And the thing that really, really stoked me was I got him the opportunity to speak and share his story at the conference. And he got the microphone and he was on the stage. And I heard him share the story of how God had been working in his life all the way back to Rwanda. And I can remember at the time, I'm watching this young man up front, this future leader, share his heart, and just thinking, we need to put the microphone down and we need to give it to our friends more. It brought me incredible joy to hear him share his heart and to tell the story about what God's been doing in his life. And it was wonderful. Right before that, he got baptized in August last year down at the lake. That's how our African friends like to do it, in Lake Erie.
Don't you love the grin that came and the countenance changed when we get to talk about the joy and what are we seeing? Now, outside, besides the ice cream, if you look on the table that's right outside the door over here, there's a bunch of stands with QR codes. Mr. Techie over here has taken how can we get involved to support them. You can just click the QR code in your camera and it will pop up. So I want you have homework here, guys. While you're eating ice cream, you need to greet our missionaries, and you also need to check out the QR codes, because what he challenged us this morning to see how can we support our missionaries, and this is a great way. The one that tickled me was he has a wish list on Amazon that you get the link straight to, where we can help practically, and it will just arrive there in Cleveland for them to meet their needs. So that's my challenge to you tonight. But before we go have ice cream, you're going to be here all week. People are going to get to love on you. But people can be praying for you starting today. So what are a couple things that we'll ask you again later in the week? But right now, last year when Tony came, he had a giant need. And through the people in this room, that need was met. So we're very brave around here.
Okay.
Share what's on your heart today.
Well, the city of Cleveland had agreed to, we have this vocational training center on the east side of the city where we're teaching construction trade. And the city had said they were going to provide $75,000 from, it was actually from a casino money. That's basically, there's no stipulations tied to it. They're just going to give it to us for this purpose. There's an organization called the Cuyahoga Land Bank that was going to do a matching grant for $75,000. Well, that turned into somebody in the city council, even though it was unanimous to provide us this money through the casino funds, said, we're going to switch it up and we're just going to move it over to a block grant. It'll simplify things. It'll make it go faster. This was a year and a half ago. And recently, when they called us and said, you need to cease and desist all work on the building, what is going on? And they told us that what they switched us over to was a HUD, Community Development Block Grant, which means now it's a federal project. And that meant we couldn't use volunteer labor. We couldn't use our people to do things. We had to pay prevailing wage. And as we heard all of the stipulations, and they were going to be in our business through the whole thing, we had to make the decision. We went to our board and we expressed our concerns, and they echoed the same concerns, and someone on our board has done federal projects, and he said he had to hire somebody just to manage the paperwork on all this prevailing wage stuff. It was going to clearly cost us more than we were going to get. So we made the decision to back out. But now we're a year and a half behind what we were hoping to do. We do have 2 construction trade students that you saw in the video this morning if you were here. But here's the great thing. We have seen major traction. Kiki is somebody, she's been in jail before. She's formerly incarcerated. But it's the older women in the community said, We have been so worried about her for so long, but now she has purpose. And I see Jean coming to life as he's doing these vocational training things. Well, all the funds that we were going to have to be able to do this kind of went away. So we are now in the midst of trying to figure out how to shift gears, and we're going to need to raise a lot of funds to get this going. And we're okay if doing the building takes longer than we had hoped. But the fruit that we've seen from our first 3 students has made it clear to us, if we're really going to make change in people's lives, if we're really going to see change in the community, we don't need to bring more outside people in. We need to be raising up and developing people in these neighborhoods. And unfortunately, when you're in impoverished communities, a free class isn't good enough. So they're actually doing on-the-job training with us where we pay them. It's not a great wage, but they're learning skills that in the future is going to allow them to do things on their own. And we're already looking at some things with social enterprise and landscaping and some basic contracting type stuff. But we need the funds to be able to continue and have more students.
Okay, so that's Jim's side. That's the job training and funding that. But I would bet that from the refugee side that Denise might have another prayer request for us before we end.
You know, my prayers are always first and foremost just for God's wisdom and discernment for us as we move forward in making decisions, because they impact people's lives. So prayer for that is number one for me always. There's a lot of things that we need. And I mean, on the Amazon wish list, there's just basic hygiene items, socks, deodorant.
So they have a cupboard that they keep hygiene products in, and that it needs to be replenished, that they give to the refugees. And to these are things that food stamps or whatever they call it today, the EBT or whatever, can't pay for, so that they don't have access. Think of, I have a lot of middle schoolers who are multilingual kiddos who need deodorant, right? Adolescents without deodorant. So this is a big need, and it's something that most of us could stick in our budget to, send some to Denise on their way to help out and meet the need. Something very, very practical. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's close in prayer, and then we'll go off for ice cream. I see my dear husband disappeared, so I think he's doing that. The ice cream is all going to be straight out this door. There are 4 flavors, and there are sprinkles, parents. Please monitor the sprinkle department in the middle of the table. And there's also some toppings if you want those. And we have Marion Berry sorbet in honor of Denise here. And we have huckleberry ice cream and that caramel caribou, maybe that's what's there. And we went out on a limb and got cafe chocolate. We've never done a real chocolate ice cream. So if you're into chocolate tonight, we've got you covered.
I just want to say thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you for coming in, hearing our crazy story. It's not very traditional.
Not at all.
And we just really look forward to getting to know each and every one of you here this week, too. So if there's things you want to talk about, we'd love to hear them. If God has given you ideas or passions or things, I'd love to hear about them, and just encourage you. I mean, I'm a cheerleader for newcomers, but I'm a cheerleader for everybody. I want to see people experience what God has for them and what God's calling them to.
Love it. Okay, Father, we just thank you for this time with Jim and Denise, for your intervention in their lives, for all the many strange jobs and roles they've had, because you were preparing them for this fabulous ministry that they're involved in Cleveland. We would just pray for funding for that vocational center, that the practical skills, change families' lives when they can get jobs that pay a good wage. So we would just pray for that funding. We don't know where it's coming from, Father, but you do. And you can move dollars around better than any of us. So please send dollars the way of this vocational training and make the decisions very wise ones that people would see. Perhaps there's another foundation who can help. And Lord, we would just pray for wisdom for Janice and all the refugee ministries and all the people. These are real lives that they're trying to do their best to guide and to help. And we would just pray for all 9 of the members of the Cleveland team, that they would just know your presence in a deep and abiding way, and that you would guide their paths. And Father, we would just pray for us, that we would look for ways that we can help and bless and reach out to those people who are new people, newcomers here in Snohomish County as well, that you would show us how we can get involved. So we give this fellowship time up to you, and we just pray that it would be a sweet time that would honor you. In Christ's precious name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, I think they're out there. I see scoops and I see ice cream. So I don't know what order they're in. Just smile. There's 4 lines. Go out. And if it looks like they need help, somebody jump in and scoop. There we go. Thanks for coming tonight.